Alright, hello, and welcome to our second recorded lecture on audio and music in video games. There's going to be, I think, just one announcement, and we're going to talk a lot about sound in games, setting up why we care about sound, thinking about sound as information, and layers of abstraction in sound. One of the things that's not covered today is how you compose music for games. My expertise doesn't lie in composition, but hopefully I can point you towards some other informative resources that might at least sort of help you think about that as well. Primarily today we're talking about the design of sound and how to think about sound in games rather than actually write music. So the first thing is, just to get this out of the way, it's a bit of a weird time to be doing course surveys because now all of the courses have been massively disrupted. But course surveys are up and available now. You can click through this link to get there. And as with all of my classes, if a great many of you, 80% or higher, do your course reviews for this course, I'll give everyone a bonus mark to their participation grade. So, tell your friends. You guys got very, very close with the fall term GW1. So, again, you might be the first class that ever actually meets this breakpoint. So, we'll see. But before we dig into this, I want to talk about sound in games very generally. Certainly, there's a lot that we need to think about, and so hopefully this will kind of set the stage for why what we're talking about is important. So, I have left on slide animations. Oh well. So, here we have kind of the sound problem, and problem in quotation marks because, again, take this with a grain of salt. As someone that cares about game design, I see this as a place where, we could solve some of these issues. But how realistic that is kind of yet to be seen. But really, in a lot of cases for games, sound is one of the last things that gets designed and implemented. So that in itself can be a problem. Secondly, sound is actually really hard to evaluate. And by this I mean, when a game has really, really good sound design, it's not really something that you actively notice. It's something that we're starting to think about, perhaps like the quality of the background music is something that stands out to a lot of people. But in general, really good sound design, great use of sound effects, great use of location-based sounds is something that kind of falls to the wayside when we are evaluating the quality of a game. On the flip side, while great sound design isn't something that we think about that forwardly, if a game has bad or has inconsistent sound design, that is something that we immediately notice because things don't sound right. And I'm sure you've seen this in a lot of games that you've played as well. And certainly, these two things are frustrating or can be frustrating throughout the development process because, leaving sound to the end and kind of having it be an afterthought really has the potential of robbing a game of a certain degree of quality, like an extra level of polish. And of course, the quality of the sound design itself is something that the earlier that you're thinking about it, the better you can adapt and the better you can design for those elements. So there's a little bit of that frustration of how sound is evaluated and where sound falls in the design process, because really sound for sound designers, for game designers in general, is actually a very powerful tool. Now, sound in games, why is sound a powerful tool? Sound helps create mood and atmosphere in games. Interestingly enough, you'll see using different sounds or different patterns of sounds can completely change the way that a game feels. And usually, not usually, but traditionally, game sound has taken a lot of cues from the kind of sound design processes for film or for TV. And so, yes, games take a lot of cues from film sound. But there's a big difference in a lot of these aspects. So the way that a user experiences games is different than the way that a viewer would experience a film. Game sound has an interactive component. So we're not just passive listeners in this case. We as players have some agency over the kind of sounds that are being played or when they're being played. And on the other hand, when you think about directing films or TV, directors have greater control over how sound is presented. They can, very expertly cue events to different parts of a piece of music, or the sound effects that they produce. They'll know exactly how the viewer is going to see the scene, so they'll know exactly how that sound will be perceived. In games, it gets a little bit more difficult because we don't know where the camera will be pointed. We don't know when a specific sound effect might be triggered, so it's a little bit harder to sequence those pieces. Now, sound in games, sound can obviously change the mood of gameplay. Oh, I'm sorry. These are benefits to good sound design in video games, basically. So, sound, yes, can help change the mood of gameplay. Sound can provide gameplay cues to players. Certainly, a lot of sounds will happen in response to things, but sound can also, in many ways, tell the player what they need to do next. Even in simple ways, sounds can add to player satisfaction, whether it's the pleasant sound of getting some kind of collectibles or, the level of quality of a piece of music, for sure. And in general, good sound design and having well thought out, well crafted sounds will overall enhance the quality of a game. So that's kind of like your first big hit to why sound is important. But there's a lot more to it than that, because we think, or many of us, think very visually. So we think about high definition graphics. And while true, graphics are there to draw the player into the scene, the sound provides an additional layer of immersion. And in some ways, sound can be more compelling for immersion than just the way that the graphics look. And I think, again, it's something that you'll hear more about next year in your game sound course, but realistic sounds, as it turns out, are a lot easier to replicate than realistic graphics. You may have heard in your graphics class, or you may hear in a future graphics class, about this phenomenon called the uncanny valley, where if a graphics, or where when character graphics become, or as they approach photorealism, they become unsettling to look at, because your brain will recognize them as, okay, this is human-like, but something is off and something doesn't quite feel right about this image or this character. So that's pretty interesting. But the brain, it's a little bit easier to trick the brain into understanding certain sounds as being certain things, which is why I think like Foley studios are so compelling, because you can turn something like a shaking foil sheet and alter that very slightly and have it be believable as perhaps the sound of thunder. Just as a quick example. Sound is also important because we definitely have limited screen space, although maybe not for long, depending on where virtual and augmented reality go. But really thinking about it, sound doesn't just live on a screen. Sound is all around us. So in a game, you're not just limited to the sounds that would be presented by things that are on camera. You could hear things that are beside you or behind you to give additional context, or perhaps additional threat notification to the player. So this immersion piece is really important. And I think just to kind of step aside for a quick moment here, immersion really happens in immersion has like three levels. And so we've probably heard these words thrown around a lot, and this might provide some context to these things. So the first level of immersion is engagement, where a player is engaged with the game. They're investing some time and some attention, and kind of like they're putting themselves a little bit into the game to kind of learn how to play. And so it's not, things aren't happening completely automatically, but the game has captured their attention at this point. The next level down is engrossment, where it's possible for a player to become emotionally affected by the game. And this is where you see a lot of kind of games lie, where players are able to play without thinking about what each of the controls do, and it becomes very easy to execute game actions without really thinking about how to do them. And then finally, we have total immersion, which is closely related to, that flow state that we talk about, where players start to feel a little bit cut off from reality, and the game becomes the only thing that really matters at this point. So, as mentioned before, sound can kind of like push the player even like a step down to the next layer of immersion, and so it's as I mentioned, a powerful tool. Okay, so let's talk about classifying audio first. If we're going to be designing audio, we need to know kind of what the sound-based tools that we have are. So first off, we have adaptive audio, and this is any kind of game audio that is reacting to or anticipating the gameplay. And of course, because there's this interaction component, this makes adaptive audio unique to games. You wouldn't find something like this in film or or television. And so the easiest way to think about adaptive audio is how the music track or the sound that's playing changes as a result of what's going on in gameplay. So depending on what the player is doing, the audio might speed up or slow down, or perhaps the audio would add additional instruments for effect in certain areas. A really simple example of this is if you're playing any of the Mario games that are time related. So even Super Mario Brothers, the very first one, Super Mario World certainly has this as well. But when your time starts running out, the audio speeds up in an effort to hopefully hurry the player along to their goal. So adaptive audio, that's the first thing that we need to know about and be thinking about. Next is interactive audio. And interactive audio is any sound that occurs in reaction to gameplay. So these are sounds that essentially a player causes. So, if the player swings a sword against an object, that should respond with some kind of sound. Maybe it's like a pot shattering or something, but the player caused that sound to happen. Similarly, sounds that happen when, we pick up health or ammo in a game, things like that. And these kinds of sounds are often seen, not often, but depending on the context of these sounds, they can be seen as kind of like reward systems, things that help the player identify their goals, or in the case of, maybe in Zelda games, some of them, if you kind of poke your sword against the wall will make a noise, and if that wall is bombable, you can, break the wall and go through it to a hidden passage. That sound will be different or have a different quality to it than the regular kind of like wall tapping sound. So this can also help players focus on certain objects. And then wrapping these two together, we also need to think about dynamic audio. So dynamic audio is audio that either changes in the gameplay environment or in response to the player somehow. And so both adaptive and interactive sounds can also have this dynamic quality. So dynamic is just the element that refers to the change in the sound. And so, okay, we've talked a little bit about, we got some definitions out of the way. And certainly we've talked a lot about feedback as well. Having effective user feedback is important in all areas of games, especially in user interfaces. If a user is interacting with something, they should understand that, the interface with the game is responding to their input. And sound plays an effect here as well, as far as, UIs and other interactions within games. Excuse me. But yeah, even with menu buttons, having a sound that plays as you click on that menu button makes that whole process feel a little bit more tactile, or the player being able to interact with the menu. And even in games, it can be flipping switches, pressing buttons. All of these things having a sound associated with them makes that action more believable. But you also have to be careful when you're putting sounds in games, because although sound is extremely powerful, sound should never completely replace visual elements. It should be there to enhance them, but unless you're designing a game specifically around this idea of playing with sound, oftentimes players will need those visual elements to give them context for the kinds of sounds that they're hearing. And of course, we need to consider things like accessibility. If you have voiceover, for example, you can enhance those visually by giving subtitles or other visual cues as to which character is speaking. And something else that's just kind of a nice thing to do is give players a volume slider, let them choose what level of audio they want to have in game. Just kind of a nice thing to do as a developer. Okay. This is going to be, I think, fairly cut and dry in terms of classifications, but I want to briefly kind of talk about the types of audio in games and give you an opportunity to kind of listen to and think about some of these things. So I have a lot of links here, and we'll probably be doing a lot of pause as necessary, but we'll go through kind of the three: background music, sound effects, and voiceover. So first up is background music, and background music is there to help set the tone of the scene for players. Context is always very important, and the kinds of sound that plays gives some additional context. Now, the density of the piece of music, of course, is up to the designer or up to the composer. You can have really obvious or musical tracks for the player to enjoy that will accompany gameplay. You may instead choose to have a softer or more ambient track to provide atmosphere to a scene. One thing that you need to be aware of, though, is that whichever of, wherever on this scale you fall, both of these might need to loop depending on the situation. Because if you have, a piece of background music that's playing in a certain level, you don't necessarily know how long a player is going to be spending in that level. So you would need that piece of music to transition smoothly into itself if you have to start playing it from the beginning again. Now, the rhythm of the game track will usually match the pace of gameplay. Not always, but usually. And here we can start thinking about adaptivity again, where, again, we have this strange property of music that's unique to games, but the background music changes or adapts to what is happening on screen. So in some games you see that they have, some similarities between tracks that will let them transition into one another or integrate new instruments into existing tracks. And we'll see some of these throughout. Actually, I think the next slide has the examples on it. But Res and Lumens do this a lot. Fez has a ridiculous adaptive soundtrack. Near Automata has multiple versions of each track with different instruments that will change based on how close a player is to a certain part of the environment or where in the narrative of a given level they are. So this is a very, very interesting thing to think about beyond just like a piece of music that plays while gameplay is happening. So here's your examples. What you want to look at from games like Res and Lumens are the sounds that come up as the player interacts with things. I think Res does this the most cleanly. In this video, you'll see the player moving a targeting reticle around the screen, locking onto enemies and shooting them. And every time an enemy is hovered over, a certain sound occurs. Every time the player fires and those enemies get damaged or destroyed, those noises blend into the background music. It's quite fascinating. So pause, stop listening to me for a second and go check that out and see what's going on, or see what that sounds like. I kind of mentioned before Near Automata doing this. I believe this video is the approach and the kind of introduction to the carnival level, the amusement park. And so what you would listen for here is, as the player approaches, you can hear, you can faintly hear some of the elements of that music track. And I believe, sorry, it's hard to talk about without seeing it, so I'm kind of trying to walk through myself in my head. So I believe that there's a fight which is a little bit less interesting from the musical perspective, but as the characters travel deeper into the amusement park, not only does the track become louder, but there's additional instrumentation and vocals that get added as key parts of the level are reached. If you watch it for a while, eventually you'll see the characters go into back alleys, and a lot of those stronger instruments will fade away while they're in the back to kind of like dull that sound, which again is very interesting. The remaining three examples, Scott Pilgrim, we talk about music at the forefront of gameplay, so this is your kind of traditional tracks that match the mood and pace of gameplay. I don't know, I just think it was a track in a level that I enjoyed and was like, yeah, sure, okay, cool, we'll show that one. To look at more ambient soundtracks, you can go through Journey, I think, is a great example of music that kind of takes the backseat to the actual gameplay and enhances the mood that way. And last but not least, looking at Thomas Was Alone, certainly the voiceover does a lot to help this game as well. But if you listen to the music tracks, it makes it, or the way that Thomas Was Alone is presented in general, makes it very easy to attach oneself emotionally to the characters in this game, even though they're really only squares, boxes. So, again, stop me for a little bit and go listen to some of these and see if you can pick out the kind of things that I've been talking about. All right. So next up, I kind of want to take an aside because sometimes we have, or when we're thinking about background music, sometimes background music will have vocals involved, and a lot of these have vocals as instrumentation. And I think this is really interesting because sorry, I'm trying to find the right words for this. The language of vocals becomes important. So both of these games, Persona 5 and Nier Automata, come from the kind of like Japanese development culture. And both of these songs have vocals included in them. Persona 5 has English vocals, and Nier Automata has vocals that don't actually... The language doesn't really exist. It's a mix of like Germanic, Gaelic, and a couple of other languages. I think there's a write-up on it somewhere. It's fascinating. But what's really interesting in this is when you think about these being developed in the Japanese culture, English, while understood in a lot of places, isn't something that I guess you could count on the average Japanese player to be fluent in. And so it means that the words in both of these songs aren't really there to listen to or to understand, but they're there to add to the quality of the music. But this makes an interesting thing happen when they come to us, to English-speaking places, because now, if we're listening to Last Surprise, for example, our brain is parsing those words and saying, okay, well, I'm listening to this and I'm trying to understand what the vocalist is saying. Whereas with Nier Automata, because the language isn't something that's even close to comprehensible, at least as words that we understand, we see those vocals more as an instrument, and we see them adding to the quality of the music without really trying to understand what they might mean. And this is, I think, is really interesting. I don't think my explanation here is kind of doing it justice, but I think take this idea forward with you, and it might change the way that you think about some of these other tracks in the future. But back on topic, I suppose. Sound effects are kind of like the next slice that we'll look at after background music. And sound effects, of course, are often used to provide some kind of feedback to the player, whether this is their health going down, their health going up, engines revving, players picking up resources. And sound effects can take many forms. They can be realistic, or they can be artificial, and I'm going to spend some time talking about this specific thing a little bit later. But sound effects, again, can be created in a Foley studio, they can be digitally constructed, or they can be some mixture of these two things. Now, one thing to notice is that certainly, and I think Humble Bundle has done this in the past, but certainly there are existing libraries of sounds, even like freesound.org, for example. But I would caution you on overusing some of these resources, because what you'll find with sound effects is that once you hear a sound effect and associate it with a certain moment or action, you'll, or at least I do, you may remember that in future scenarios. So let's say you have, I don't know, I'm blanking, but take, for example, the sound of picking up coins in Mario. To hear that sound somewhere else, you would associate it with Mario, not the sound, or not the action that you're hearing it in this other context with. So you might wind up finding a sound that has been used somewhere else, and players are reacting in a way that you don't expect to it, because perhaps that they're more familiar with it from a different space. So something to kind of watch out for if you're looking more at using pre-existing sounds rather than making your own. And finally, voiceovers are pretty cut and standard, recorded lines that have read by real people, and now usually this is some kind of professional voice actor, because as we find out, when non-professionals do a lot of voice work, it often sounds quite bad. But when you're thinking about voiceovers, and when you're thinking about perhaps using voice lines for your own games, try and find a way to use these rather sparingly, mostly for budget reasons. Think about this. So if you're recording voices for your characters, you might need to do many takes of your actor reading the same response, even for things like screams or grunts, just so you can have some variety. Because if you hear the same sound perhaps every time the character takes damage with no variation. This is going to get old very, very quickly, and will come across much more campy and unappealing. Furthermore, if your game has a non-linear story where there's lots of branching paths, you would need to record like lots and lots of dialogue for important NPCs, enough that would cover each specific scenario. For example, if a character lives, an NPC might say one thing, and if a character dies, an NPC might say something completely different. And this is just a very simple, like, binary lives or dies choice that we already need to consider different options for. And ultimately, when we're talking about voiceovers, voice lines, not having enough variety in some of these things, like perhaps that character damage noise that I just talked about, will not only, as I said, kind of feel campy and kind of reduce the quality of the sound, the quality of the game, but it will also drastically decrease the immersion that your players are feeling. And voiceovers definitely can be good and can be bad. And I think take this with, again, a little bit of a grain of salt, because the good examples of voiceovers I have for you to listen to are very recent. And so these are very clear, like, high budget, very professionally acted pieces. Whereas if you look at some of the, air quotes, bad voiceovers, these are more, these games are a little bit older before, I guess, we as developers realized that we needed actors. Certainly you could dig through more recent games and find examples of bad voice acting. But I think the way that these scenes and the way that the acting in these scenes kind of like takes you out of that kind of, words are hard today, I don't understand. But the way that the voice acting in these scenes takes you out of that immersion and, adds perhaps a comical piece to the game where maybe, especially in the case of, Jill Sandwich, there shouldn't be a piece of comedy to that game or to that scene. Again, it really detracts from the experience. But all right, so we've finally made it. Let's talk about designing sounds for games. We got all the kind of introductory stuff out of the way. We're done thinking. Definitely go back and take a listen to some of those videos that I've linked if you haven't already. But let's talk about how we think about designing sounds. So at a high level, designing sound effects for games is all about mapping a sound-based response to an action within the game world. And we kind of do this one of two ways. Either we do this realistically, where we're attempting to recreate the sound that whatever action or object would make in the real world, or we can do this in an abstract way, where we're building a sound or building a series of sounds that are then going to represent that action. And here's some quick examples. Think about footsteps in a game as a realistic sound. A character is walking, the sound of their feet against the ground is making some kind of noise, like a step, 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 step. And so, okay, this is kind of a realistic sound for that. What you would expect footsteps to sound like, of course. Or in a menu or something, you might hear different kinds of beeps or boops. And this would be your abstract style sounds. These are sounds that we make that certainly will represent something in the game, but aren't evocative of the real world the real world version of that act. Okay, so on the note of realism, I want to talk a little bit about diegesis, and I think that we may have brought this up before. Certainly you'll hear it again before your design career is out. But diegesis, in short, I guess, is a concept that we take from narrative design, And it's got this really complex definition dealing with in-world and out-of-world elements. So what we care about is kind of like the following classifications. A sound, or really anything, but a sound for our purposes can be diegetic if that sound comes from a source within the game world that the character that we're playing, or any player character, any NPC, could hear. So this is a sound that happens inside of the game world. This could be footsteps, this could be a door opening, it could be the sound of a gun firing, things that characters within that game world would be able to hear. On the other hand, we can talk about non-diegetic sounds. And the difference here is that non-diegetic sounds are not from a source that is in the game world. And non-diegetic sounds then are only heard by the player, not by the characters. The easiest ways, or the easiest examples of this are the sounds that happen in a menu. You open the menu, the characters aren't experiencing that menu is just for you, the player. So any kind of menu sounds, any kinds of objective pings, things that are layered on top of the game world that are not heard by the characters in the game. And as I said, diegesis isn't just limited to sound. We talked a little bit about this in tutorials. We mentioned building instructions into the game world, and some of the things there are diegetic. Things like the guide in Terraria, for example, has conversations with the player's character, and then he becomes a diegetic element of tutorialization. So that's something in the world that helps us learn stuff. Tomb Raider has white markings on trees that you can shoot rope arrows into, for example. And again, that's an in-world marking that Lara Croft can see, a diegetic element that has helped us learn something. So that's cool. You also see this in UI. Dead Space is a great example, where the menu isn't your typical game menu. It's a projector on the suit of the main character, which is kind of interesting because the main character is actually interacting with the menu, not just the player. So that gets really interesting as well. But I think this is something interesting to think about that you don't need to kind of like deep dive just yet, but definitely be thinking about it. And we'll certainly talk about it more in the future. A good question to ask yourself is what you think is better to use in what situation. So again, keep this in mind. That might be a good journal topic, rather than kind of spoiling my version of the answer for that here in this lecture. But again, that's just me kind of rambling for a little bit. Diegesis in audio is kind of one of the big takeaways from this lecture and understanding. We'll build on this as we kind of go along. So, stepping away from that for a little bit, I want to talk about informative audio in games. This is one of the big spaces where audio design becomes interesting and important, because usually we're using sound to specifically tell the player that something is happening. And this is useful because it offloads some of the cognitive processing of whatever visual information is on screen. This means that sound is really good for fast-paced games or any general situation when a gameplay decision needs to be made in a short period of time. We don't have just to pick apart and understand visual information. We can also kind of like at the same time process audio. So if we're trying to tell our players that something is happening or give them some information throughout or from sound, there's a lot of situations that have been described, or specific situations, specific purposes for sound to deliver audio. And so they are the following: impending death, local or global notifications, damage, environmental awareness, physical effects, invisible structures or hidden information, dynamic changes, abnormal or strange structures, events in space, impairment, and time limits. And so we'll touch kind of briefly on each of these. First is pretty easily. Impending death as informative audio is maybe one of the most prominent ways that you will hear sound communicating information to the player, because generally health is the player's most important resource in any given game. And so having some kind of audio cue when you're near death can help players manage their level of gameplay aggression, can help change the kinds of gameplay decisions that they're making. And you might hear, depending on what kind of game you're playing, this might be that beeping noise that Pokemon plays when your character has low health. They might be really deep heartbeat noises in a game like Call of Duty. They could be heavy breathing. Anything along that kind of scope. And different sounds for this have different effects and capabilities. Different sounds are more annoying than others. Really, the kind of sound you would use for this is dependent on the kind of game that you're building, of course. Next, we think about notifications. This is kind of a sweeping category that's just ways to notify players of some change in their environment. In a competitive game, you might have a voiceover that says that your flag has been captured or your tower is under attack. And designing for these can sometimes be difficult because depending on, again, how much visual information a player is processing or how intense the gameplay might be at a given moment, some of these sounds might be difficult for players to notice as they fade into the background if the player is doing something important. So if you're using some notification sounds, it's important to test and choose sounds that the players are going to react and respond to. Damage is similar to impending death, but is a little bit less intense, let's say. Damage is there to notify a player that they have been hit or that they have lost some health. And again, like with the impending death noises, when we have a lot of visual feedback on screen, sometimes that can cause confusion, and the exact amount of health lost or the exact severity of the damage might be lost, or it might not be conveyed accurately through those visual cues. So having some kind of damage sound at all is very important. And if you really want to, if you really want to convey your damage in a good way, think of ways to increase the severity of that damage sound as the player's health gets lower. Perhaps it goes from kind of like a soft thud into something more like visceral and I don't know, crunchy. I don't know, it depends, and it would depend on the game for sure. Environmental awareness sounds are sounds that notify a player of what's going on immediately around them. Again, these can be footsteps, they can be gunfire, they can be the alert sound from games like Metal Gear Solid. In general, these kinds of sounds are just there to help players identify and track threats. So, again, using some kind of audio cues to notify players of threats that are in their immediate area. Next are, kind of a bunch of shorter ones. Physical events are, things that have happened in the game world. So let's say a player throws an object out of the view of their camera. The sound that plays when that object impacts with the wall or the floor will tell the player information about what has happened to that object. So did it bounce? Did it shatter? Did something else happen? We don't know. But the sound can tell us that because despite the fact that we haven't seen it. Invisible structures and hidden information. You can use sound or changes in sound to tell players information about objects in the game. So, again, I talked about this before, but tapping your sword on a wall in the Zelda games to find which walls sound different, and therefore which walls can be, bombed open to access different passages. Dynamic changes are not only a quality of sound, but also can convey information about whatever object is playing that sound. So think about, filling some kind of container or a jug with water or whatever liquid, and as that jug fills up, the sound that it makes will change as it becomes full. I feel like this is something that's evident in like old cartoons or something, because those kinds of sounds are very exaggerated. But that's actually a good example there. So think about Halo or other sci-fi games, the kind of sound that makes when your shields are recharging. So you have low shields, and then as your shield bar fills up, it goes boo, and kind of like the pitch of that sound changes as the health bar kind of goes up. Abnormal structures is kind of like a fancy way of saying things that are broken or are not working correctly. So if an object is malfunctioning in some way, usually the sound that it makes is equally or in some way abnormal, just to indicate that it's broken. Events in space are kind of similar to the either environmental awareness or physical events, where you would hear doors opening, you might hear gunfire around a corner to let you know about things or threats that you can't perhaps see. Next, we'd look at impairment, so thinking about sounds that we use to, rather than enhance, sounds that we use to limit the player's understanding of the environment. And these are, sometimes they come through weapons, so like flashbangs, where if you're playing an FPS and you get hit by a flashbang, you not only have kind of a bright white screen, but you have that really high-pitched, not hissing sound, but almost the sound of tinnitus, basically. A really high-pitched whine, there you go. So that limits the player's ability to hear things, other informative things in their space. FPSs sometimes will also do this when you have low health. Everything kind of like becomes hollow sounding, for example. And while we often think about sound as augmenting or adding to a game, this idea of using sound to hinder or take some elements away can add depth, can add immersion, can add realism in the game. And the kind of importance of this maybe more negative piece is really creating tension in some of those gameplay scenarios. Next, you can look at time limits, so sound that tells players about how much time they have left to complete a task. So basically any noise that tells the player they're doing a timed portion of the game. Usually for timed puzzles, you'd hear like a clock tick. Although it scarred me often as a child, the background music speeding up and kind of like the Jaws-esque theme that plays as you run out of time in Sonic 2 being underwater. I've lost my train of thought because, again, I'm thinking about it now and it's making me a little bit anxious. But again, these kinds of sounds that play in those time segments add to the tension of that scenario. And the sound here goes a long way to, I'm going to kind of, again, step aside here, but when we think about designing time limits in games, we want those time limits to be fair, and oftentimes this means giving players way more time than they actually need to complete the task. Because let's face it, sometimes players do things very, very slowly. Your average player would never have a problem with any given time segment, really. But even if you have an extremely conservative amount of time, if you play like a tense sounding, time limit piece of audio for that immediately will add tension and make the players behave or react in a specific way, or not a specific way, but like a certain way. And it might make them, again, a little bit anxious, and you can use that emotion to basically just drive better experiences. So this is, these are a lot of ways that we can, a lot of different options that we have, or a lot of different kinds of information that we can present to players through the use of sound. But we also think about how or what kinds of information we present to players, because sound is just one of the senses, and so we can use multiple to provide information all at the same time. And you can do this in different ways depending on your design goals. So you can present information in a complementary way, where each sense, maybe visual and hearing, is provided with some kind of useful information, but each sense is receiving different information, and so together the player has a more complete picture of whatever you're trying to communicate to them. Sometimes, and it's, I think, harder to do this convincingly, but you can provide conflicting information. So each sense is receiving information that contradicts itself. I don't know, maybe the eyes see, hey, this room is safe, but the ears hear, hey, this room is not safe. And so that might be, a common way of doing this. But that might also cause a player to react in a certain way, just by the way, or by the means of having, being told kind of two different things at the same time. And of course, redundant information can be beneficial to things like accessibility, but this is really when both or all of the senses that you're interacting with are receiving the exact same information. And visually, or what this might look like is, simply during a conversation between two characters, your ears are hearing the voice of a character, and your eyes are, seeing the subtitles of what words they're saying. All right. So, I don't have section headers. I don't like this. Sorry. I do want to take a little bit of time. I talked about kind of like artificial and realistic sounds a little bit before. And I definitely I want to highlight that both of these kinds of sounds are useful. It's not the case that, you should only have realistic sounds in your game or only have abstract sounds in your game. They're both useful. Sometimes they're useful for different things. Sometimes they're useful for the same things. But one of the things that I looked at when I was in grad school is what kind of defines an abstract sound versus a realistic sound. And I did a bunch of interviews, and it's interesting that it's not just kind of one thing, where so I've highlighted it as there are kind of internal factors and external factors that define whether what you're hearing is an abstract or a realistic sound. So certainly the realism of the sound is kind of depending on, or the level of realism of the sound is depending on what exactly is making that sound. So that is kind of like your first clue as to, okay, well, sorry. I'm kind of I'm talking with my hands and you can't see this and it's not good for you. Okay, so there's a number of internal factors. First is the source of the sound. So the thing that's making the sound, and as a result of that, the actual sound that is being made from that thing. If it sounds realistic, then that is going to make that sound like a realistic sound. I realize that sounds very contrived. We'll get there. The next thing that is relevant is the level of diegesis of a sound. So remember before we talked about diegetic sounds as being sounds that are in the game world that characters can hear, or non-diegetic sounds being sounds that aren't in the game world that only players can hear. If a sound is diegetic, so if it's a sound that characters can hear, characters are exposed to, this makes that sound automatically feel more realistic, because then we have the ability for our characters to react to it. So that makes those sounds a little bit more, as I said, realistic. And finally, we look at, whether we as developers or designers intend that sound to be realistic. And the way it matters here is that through our intention, we're kind of like driving what that sound is supposed to be. So if I'm talking about gunfire and I'm like, okay, I want this gun to sound realistic, so it's going to sound like this, that goes a long way as well. And so when I was originally looking at this, that was kind of originally where I stopped. I thought, okay, sound realism or sound abstraction is really only relevant when you're making the sounds or when you're designing the game. However, through some of these interviews, I found out that really the players and the users play a role in this as well. So you can design a sound to be realistic, you can have it be in-world, but at the end of the day, what makes that sound realistic is actually how it is perceived. So I say that there are also external factors to this. So first of all, player expectations. Do they expect that object to be making a realistic sound? Yes or no? And in line with that is this idea of perceived realism. So if we go back to our example here where I'm saying, okay, I'm designing a sound for shooting a gun. I want it to sound realistic, so it sounds like this, blah, blah, blah. But let's say that me, as a designer, I have never shot a gun, so I don't actually know what a gun sounds like. I just know what I think a gun sounds like. And so that's how I build that sound out. Maybe a given player of my game has shot a gun and knows what that actually sounds like. So maybe they would expect that sound, or they would expect that gun to sound realistic because, sure, why not? However, because of their own experiences, they don't perceive my sound to be realistic because, again, they know that this gun sounds like this, and I had done it wrong, so this sound becomes a little bit more abstract. And this framework certainly is a little bit loose, but again, it helps us think about how to build sounds and what kind of like our experiences need to be based on our, or to put forth what we intend. So again, something to think about. And, as far as usefulness of kind of this framework goes, your mileage may vary. And especially, given all of this and my kind of rambling about it, you're probably asking why you care in the first place. And I hinted at this a little bit earlier, where, some sounds or some kinds of sounds are better for certain jobs than others. So I have found, a few years ago, that when it comes to, remaining health, players are actually better at predicting their level of health with more realistic health sounds. So if they're hearing, like a heartbeat sound, they're better at saying, oh, okay, I have this much health left, rather than if they're hearing like a beeping sound or kind of an alarm sound, which is interesting and weird. I also found out that players react faster to more abstract sounds. And you have to take all of this with a big asterisk, because the way that research works and whatever, we need to have a lot of things that are, the way that research works is really you have to do multiple studies and multiple, cases of things to really confirm that this is definitely the effect this has. So currently, as far as I'm aware, the research study that I did into this is, the one where it exists. So having follow-up research like in the future to confirm it would be great. It's no longer my area of research, but I've included a link to that paper and the general findings of kind of my grad school work if you're interested and maybe you're looking to read a really kind of dry academic paper. I don't know. But yeah, so if you care about this kind of thing, maybe take a look at that. But here's, excuse me, here's probably what you have come for today in terms of game design and sound design. So I've kind of front-loaded you with a bunch of information. Here are the recommendations, and these are, again, out of my thesis, but I do think that they are relevant. Okay. I think if you're designing audio for informative feedback that's directly related to the player character, although this isn't research confirmed, I would say favor realistic sounds over abstract ones. Just based on how I've seen some players react to it, and yeah, again, kind of your mileage may vary. I don't know what's going on here today, but yeah. So I would recommend if you're designing audio for feedback that's related to your player character, favor realistic sounds over abstract ones. There seems to be something there. Definitely, much like with tutorialization, if you have abstract audio, players might not always understand what the abstract audio is telling them. So give them a safe environment to learn the meaning of those abstract audio cues as well. If you're ever working in a larger team, loop someone in from the sound team in your early game design decisions to make sure that the sound team is on board with what the game is going to be about, and they have some insight into what kinds of sounds they need to be developing earlier rather than later in the development process. If you're doing some audio to alert players of impending death, the best time to do that would be between 25 and 35% health. Any later than that, and it becomes kind of too late for a player to react to, and any earlier than that, the player has too much health left, and they might start ignoring those kinds of impending death audios. One thing, and I think I touched on this when I was talking about informative audio in general, but you definitely need to provide your players with a clear auditory indication that they're being damaged in a game. And in general, keep in mind the power that you have with audio, and make sure that, again, when you're building these longer form game projects, look into ways that you can leverage the ability of audio to provide and to enhance feedback within a game. So, in summary, we've kind of done a little bit of a lot. So we looked at some definitions of game sound. We looked at, and you listened to, different types of sounds in games. We talked a little bit about diegesis. We talked about the kinds of information that you can get from sounds. We looked at abstraction and realism in sounds. And we went over, again, just a very few high-level sound design recommendations. So that's it for this week. Thank you very much. And just as kind of like one extra thing that I thought was neat, you can look, sometimes you see theming in melodies for background music, and again, this is hard for me to point out without being there to do it for you, but listen to these pairs of tracks and see if you can kind of pull out the common thread between them. Neither pair sounds exactly the same, but some of the motifs, or I'm sorry, I don't speak musician, so motif might not be the word that I'm specifically looking for, but some of the elements in each of these tracks are repeated in their counterpart maybe with different maybe with different instrumentation, maybe with different speed, but there are certainly common threads between these two videos here, as well as these two videos here. And of course, it doesn't just exist in Undertale, but the progression that's used in these Undertale examples is actually a little bit easier to pick out because it's very strikingly similar. So again, just as an extra thing if you're interested in looking for some of that stuff. But regardless, thank you, and I will see you whenever the final video gets posted up.